It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Marianne Broeker from the University of Oxford, where she is a DPhil candidate in experimental psychology. She's in her third year, and she works on changes in the consciousness of psychosis. And she's very much interested also in the philosophy of psychiatry, so she's also into philosophy. And she will give a presentation today that combines those two fields. And the title of her talk is Limits of Formalization: Which Aspects of the Human Experience Can Enter Algorithmic Models? Marianne, the floor is yours, and the seat also.
Gonna make sure this works. Yeah, okay. Yeah, hello everyone. I don't Okay. Yeah, so my talk is not going to be so much about large language models, but more about Bayesian models. So because I don't know how familiar people are with those, we're also going to go over some basics. But first of all, and some of the topics might resonate with previous talks, so which maybe is a good thing. I hope it won't be too redundant.
Yeah.
Okay, can we make this? Okay. Maybe we can. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so to illustrate the difference between the psychological and phenomenological level, I used the example of the paradox of the Achilles and the tortoise. I don't know how familiar people are with this paradox. And so basically the paradox goes like this, that Achilles is obviously a lot faster than the tortoise. When they both are put into a race and the tortoise is giving a head start, say of 10 meters, by the time Achilles reaches these 10 meters, the tortoise will have advanced 1 meter because Achilles is 10 times as fast as the tortoise. By the time Achilles reaches the 1 meter where the tortoise was at, the tortoise will have advanced 1/10 of that, and so on until kind of infinity, right? So based on this mathematical description, which we have now, or which has been debunked, right? But based on this kind of paradox or description, Achilles will never actually catch up with the tortoise, right? Which seems absurd, because if we would measure it empirically, we would get to a completely different result. So I have to manage both. Okay, yeah, so we have, on the one hand, so we can describe motion. We will not talk about motion today. This is just to illustrate the point. You can describe motion in lots of different ways. So we can describe it mathematically with the concept of infinite divisibility of time and space. So this would be a third person kind of external observer or mathematical perspective, which is here, which I just explained with the paradox. We can maybe collect empirical evidence of that. I mean, it would be difficult to collect empirical evidence of that specific formula. And then we obviously have the phenomenological or first-person perspective of motion of Achilles or the tortoise, right? The point here is that mathematical descriptions can capture phenomena more or less accurately. And in this case, it would be a very inaccurate description of what's going on. So especially for Bayesian models, so I come from clinical psychology and schizophrenia in particular, where Bayesian models are very, very popular. A lot of the time, it starts with the model and then the data is being collected to kind of fit the model. But we see in this example that this would be a very wrong thing to do. And what's also important here, again, is to emphasize that we have two ways of describing it, mathematically and empirically, but still that would probably be quite distinct from the phenomenological perspective of that. Okay, so the bigger questions we're going to address here in this talk are, does it make sense to describe first-person perspective mathematically, which is what Bayesian models are doing? So we will use the Bayesian approach throughout this talk. When and under what conditions can we describe aspects of the human experience mathematically, and which mental processes can we formalize more generally? But everything here will be in reference to psychosis, just as an example to like run through these different scenarios and Bayesian models. Okay, so in terms of computational psychiatry and a Bayesian approach, mostly it's used in psychiatry or psychology, and there are a few ontological assumptions which philosophers know about, but people that use the models usually don't really. It depends. But I think they're important to just emphasize. So the first one is that mental capacities consist, so these are the assumptions that these models are based on, that mental capacities consist of information processing algorithms that can be formalized. And so this is an understanding of the mind and pathology as algorithmic processes. Then psychopathology evolves around minimizing general uncertainty. That's also the free energy principle by Carl Friston of the immediate external environment. So that's also always kind of a given. It's always the external environment, rather something subjective, or the subjective environment. This implies that pathology evolves in the realm of a shared single external objective world that entails uncertainties and hidden states of the world. Thus, computational psychiatry entails assumptions that aberrations in free energy minimization are driving psychopathology. And lastly, this is more kind of inferred based on the experiments that are usually being used. So everything is in a very kind of cognitive tradition that psychopathology unfolds around, and this is very specific to psychosis. Yeah, everything in this talk is specific to psychosis. That psychopathology unfolds within the rational optimal decision-making processes. Again, this is derived on the experiments that usually take place that operationalize decision-making processes, and therefore these are mostly captured in these models. Okay, before we go into a more phenomenological understanding, and if this could be modeled, there's one more kind of quirk about Bayesian models that I wanted to put at the beginning of the presentation. Are people here familiar with Bayesian models, like a little bit? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to explain this too much. So we have a prior probability, right? So we want to predict what's going to happen next. We have sensory evidence that comes in, and we have a prior probability, which are being combined to kind of make the prediction, and then kind of see if there's an error or not. And if there's an error, the model will be updated. So we have the prior, we have the probability we have the incoming sensory evidence, and both of these parameters here have a precision weight. So this is important to keep in mind, because there's something very interesting about Bayesian models in terms of it's very hard to falsify them. So you can have all sorts of experiments and the model will basically always fit. And we will see this with the example of change blindness. So change blindness is, people are usually familiar with what change blindness is. That, like, if I, for example, focus on my computer because I'm giving a presentation, and I wouldn't notice that something is being rebuilt in the corner of the room. And so that's change blindness, and change blindness has been used as an argument against the predictive processing hypothesis, that our brains aren't predictive processing machines since they don't alert us to the changes of the environment. Then people of the Bayesian camp would argue, or would say to this, that there can be higher or lower precision weights or confidence on prediction error signals, so that we can either like put too much or too little weight on the prediction error signals. This determines how seriously the brain is going to take the error signal. Yeah. The problem with this is, and this is why it becomes relevant or gets relevant for phenomenology as well, is we don't really have, or there's no theory of a mechanism that would tell us, which you would need for a model, that would tell us when we would need more or less precision weight on the prior or on the posterior. So there's no theory at all for this, but we would assume, just from like person or first person experience, that given someone's context or situation, that would determine if we assume more or less weight. So like how much weight, so this precision weight, if we go back, oops. This precision weight would be something that would actually be very subjective. But the model obviously can't capture subjectivity. And what the Bayesian models usually do, if something is subjective, they wouldn't label it as such. They would come up with some normative assumptions of what would be the most kind of optimal way of assigning these weights. So they're kind of moving subjectivity into normativity, which a lot of the time can make sense based on specific theories, but sometimes it's also really, really arbitrary. And with this in mind, so for psychosis alone, some theories say if they just look at delusion, some theories say, oh, there's more weight on the prior, others say there's more weight on the posterior, so given the data that they've collected. So which makes it quite meaningless in a sense, if you just kind of tweak the model in either way to make the data fit. Or even, we have listed the autism example also. So lots of conditions are explained in terms of giving more weight to predictions or giving more weight to sensory evidence. So then So the second objection, which is very, in a way, similar, has to do with placebos and honest placebos, right? So again, thinking about the precision weights. So a placebo obviously is the belief that a medication will work, even though it's just a placebo. Then an honest placebo is the absence of the belief or the disbelief that a medication will work. And which still affects someone's experience. So there's the absence of belief, and it's still the medication still works, right? So we could say, how can a belief and a disbelief impact our experience in the same way? Because here, again, based on a Bayesian model, we would say the prior knowledge is affecting the incoming sensory evidence or our experience. And then people from the Bayesian camp would say there are conscious and unconscious prior beliefs. So we have two types of prior beliefs that can be either conscious or they can be unconscious. So honest placebos are still affecting us because they just operate on an unconscious level. So because you've been given the medication by a doctor, there's a hospital setting. So this makes you think, oh, there must be something that works. So one time the placebo is a conscious belief and the honest placebo would be an unconscious belief that would impact our experience. Again, here we can ask the same question to say, if this is already also mechanistic, with what kind of mechanism would we determine? Because again, if we would want to model it, we would need to have some idea of a mechanism that would help us decide if a prior belief is conscious or unconscious, right? That's driving like how we interpret our sensory inputs or like how experience shows up to us. Again, there is no answer to this. There's no mechanism that kind of helps a Bayesian modeler decide. And therefore, we have the same argument as before that it's actually subjective, right? If beliefs are on the conscious, or I think it doesn't actually really make a difference if beliefs are conscious or unconscious, but it's rather like if a person is holding those beliefs with conviction, right? And then they can impact on experience and perception. But if the person is holding these beliefs with conviction is again something that is very subjective and would be very hard to put into a model. So then again, there's the move to move everything into a normative terrain to say, we arbitrarily stipulate when a belief should be conscious or unconscious and when we have aberrance of that. Okay. Okay, so we have to move from subjectivity to normativity in Bayesian models. Let's look at like how things are formalized generally. So this is something maybe people are familiar with mass levels of computations. So this is something that Bayesian accounts are based on. So we always have an input state. Then we have some kind of transformative algorithm. And these algorithms can be more or less complicated or complex. It can be Bayesian algorithms, but it can also be some kind of, like it can be all sorts of algorithms. And then we have an output state, right? So for psychiatry, this would mean that we need some kind of input. We have some transformative algorithms. And then the output would be, for example, a delusion, but we will move it into phenomenology in a second. So I hope this is clear. Okay, so to see if we can apply this logic to phenomenology, or why we can't, we first need to have an idea of what schizophrenia is or what psychosis is. So I'm using these like interchangeably for simplicity right now. so that we know how to operationalize it, right? There's lots of different accounts, and some of them are obviously a lot easier to operationalize. So we have cognitive accounts. I mean, if we go with the DSM definition of delusions being a false belief or a belief that can't be corrected in light of incoming evidence, then that would be DSM-based. We have diagnostic accounts, which are also belief-based accounts. We have perceptual accounts, which are sometimes phenomenological, sometimes more neurobiological. Then we have phenomenological accounts and self-pattern accounts, and then also like the 4E account. Obviously, sometimes there's overlaps between these accounts. I don't know, do I have half of the time left?
You have spoken 16 minutes. Yes.
Okay, then, okay, okay, so I will just jump over 2 slides because I think this is what. Okay, so if we go with, and I will spare you the explanation why we're going with the phenomenological approach. But if we take a phenomenological approach instead of these other accounts, and we have touched on this a little already. So there's, again, within phenomenology, there's lots of different approaches to psychosis. But if we go with a minimal self, an intentionality approach, or like the anxiety disorder model, right, where we say there is a fundamental kind of change in minimal self and intentionality that is happening in psychosis. Again, what the reasons for that is a different question. Yeah, but if we go with this definition, so this is just a really brief outline of minimal self, so psychosis as changes in minimal self and pre-reflective intentionality. So minimal self includes pre-reflective self-awareness, a structural feature of first-person consciousnness constrained by bodily factors, a sense of ownership minus a sense of agency, which can involve various sensory modalities. It's obviously the implicit first-person quality of consciousness that all experience articulates itself in the first-person perspective as my experience. Minimal self and word are connected through intentional engagements. Intentionality can only come about through a minimal self that drives the directedness towards the world. And then we have a bit of an outline of intentionality, although maybe let's not go over all of these points here because I'm sure it's clear what intentionality is, right? But just because we will bring this back to mass logic, this is maybe just a refresher for everybody. So Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Watsuji outlined intentionality as tacit implicit process that describes the directedness and connection of the lived body self to the intersubjective world. It determines how the world shows up to us, kind of grasping the meaning of the world for us. Husserl has also coined the term operative intentionality, a process that gives meaning prior to direct or active conscious reflection. Kruger has spoken of that we always experience things around us in a particular way, implicitly giving them subjective meaning. And you can already see how this fits into this precision weighing aspect, but in a very subjective way. Merleau-Ponty obviously also has an account that the pre-reflective moving body is intentional in itself. Intentionality is more clearly apparent in our desires, evaluations, and the landscape we see than in our objective knowledge or active reflection. Okay. So, oh, sorry, I did not go to that slide, but I read it. Okay, so both intentionality and minimal self come about through subjective engagements with the world rather than being concrete mental states. So in schizophrenia, changes in minimal self and intentionality therefore mean an instability of the self-world structure, thus the self's directedness towards the world. Okay, so now we have an idea what these changes in psychosis could be about. So now we go back to mass model. So we need some kind of inputs, and this is really kind of one of the takeaways here. We need inputs, we have some kind of transformative algorithm, and then what we want to get out, right, is changes in intentionality and minimal self to have a computational model of psychosis. Yeah, so we would need to kind of find specific inputs, then the transformative Bayesian algorithm, and then we would hope to kind of explain changes in intentionality and minimal self. Okay, so there are multiple objections to this. I'm going to present a few. And keep this model in mind. So the first one is the input dependency, or maybe also, we can maybe also call this input determinism. So when we think of maybe even having phenomenological constructs, right, that we heard about in the talk before, what's really important to keep in mind for computational models is that they are absolutely dependent on the input, right? So we would need to know what kind of goes into the model as an input state to get out whatever our construct is in the output state. Yeah, so the output is directly derived from the input and the transformative algorithm that does that, while all factors, inputs and outputs must be known and kind of fixed. Yeah, so an objection to that based on phenomenology is it's not like these two concepts of minimal self and intentionality is that it's not clear which general and individually applicable inputs would constitute outputs, again, meaning minimal self, or changes in minimal self and intentionality of that kind, since minimal self and intentionality do not arise through specific sensory or informative inputs alone. So this doesn't mean sensory and informative, meaning some kind of information that's given, and that these inputs don't matter, but they're just not sufficient. But rather in subjectively meaningful actions towards the world, thus through the constituting activity of the self, of the subject itself. Okay, so if we go to the output stage, so formalization requires adequate, concise, and very circumscribed definitions. We also heard, like in Peter's talk earlier today, right, this essentialist, the essentialist error to say we don't even have robust kind of constructs of a lot of these things. I mean, even with minimal self, right, definitions of the term still don't constitute robust circumscribed phenomena, which could easily be operationalized. Minimal self represents a multitude of cohesive and continuous phenomena, where singling out and operationalizing specific aspects would destroy the phenomena as a whole in its embodied world, self-world concrete, so that we would no longer actually modeling the phenomenon in question. So it seems almost impossible to break down a phenomena like minimal self into circumscribed parts to find the algorithmic explanation of it, which would need to go beyond looking again at isolated parts, like, for example, perception alone. Okay, so also in terms of output states, the mode in which an object is given poses an additional challenge for computational models. Modes like very clear beliefs or circumscribed mental states might be operationalizable as outcome states. However, a model would have difficulties capturing desires or other modes of access a priori, which has been pointed out by other researchers, for example, Jon, stating like that belief-like but not desire-like states can enter computational models. So even if we could model desire or other kind of similar states, we would need to predict which inputs would trigger the specific modes in which an object is given across individuals, which is an impossible task. Thus, the first person givenness, including the mode of access and the intentional qualities, are antithetical to inferential models of mental capacities, where the output is directly predicted from and contingent on the input, which is kind of a summary of the other points. So I don't know how much time do I have left?
What is this? You have some 5 to 8 minutes.
Oh, okay.
More like this.
Okay. So I think some of the points have already. Okay, I'm wondering. Okay, so there is also something in terms of. Oh. Is that? Yeah. Okay. I'll just switch this up. Sorry. Okay. So another objection is how uncertainty is being dealt with, but I think I will go to the conclusions because they're also quite dense to not overload everybody. So let's go to.
And maybe tell us the one objection, the strongest.
The strongest?
Yeah, I mean, no, sorry. Just.
Okay, so I think in the conclusions, that's also, again, to some extent, a summary. I mean, they're all strong in their own way. Okay, so Okay, so this is a summary of the main points. So specific conceptualizations of phenomena, namely when they're tied to very circumscribed processes, they can be isolated into single units, have the potential to enter computational models. So right now, most computational models are based on operationalizing, right, these cognitive components like false beliefs or like aberrant reasoning processes. And as you've seen, it's quite easy to build a model of this because the model is just mimicking kind of what we think is going on in someone's head. But again, this implies an ontological commitment, namely that schizophrenia has something to do with aberrant reasoning, which is really not a fair statement to make, I think. But these processes would be easier to operationalize and put into these models. The same is true for very circumscribed perceptual phenomena. But again, then we wouldn't be modeling something like minimal self or changes in intentionality. So understanding psychosis in terms of aberrant inferential decision-making processes, again, wouldn't be kind of an adequate way of understanding the entire phenomena. When experimental paradigms entail inferential reasoning, they are operationalizing just the reasoning process in itself, which is within a cognitive assumption of psychosis, again, being an aberration in reasoning processes. I've just already said that, I'm sorry. Then furthermore, computational models always follow a deterministic logic where specific inputs are constitutional to specific outputs. Thus, modeling a phenomena requires knowing which inputs universally kind of lead to what outputs. And that would be very difficult to do for these phenomenological concepts. Okay. Sorry, I got a little confused with my own slides and this, but okay. So we need robust, sorry, I read the lower ones first, but we'll go to the top now. We need a robust understanding of phenomena in order to formalize them so that we can break them down into circumscribed models. I think that's all very clear. Yeah, okay. So I think I've already actually said everything, but one interesting thing that I'm actually doing in my PhD, which I haven't talked about in this talk, when we think, okay, what can we actually model if we can't model minimal self? So we can again stick to something that is very circumscribed without claiming that this is tapping onto changes in intentionality or changes in minimal self. We can again stick to perceptual phenomena and put these into models. And there maybe stay with kind of first-person experience, just how things show up. But then we have to be very clear in terms of what we're modeling and what can't actually be put into a computational model.